So the passage we're going to start with is Genesis 6, verses 1, and I've got to verse 4 here. And it happened that when humanity began to multiply on the face of the ground, daughters were born to them. Then the sons of God saw the daughters of men, they were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives from all they chose. Yahweh said, My spirit shall not abide with humankind forever, in that he is also flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty warriors that were from ancient times, men of renown. So, to begin with, we'll focus on the sons of God. The sons of God is translating a Hebrew phrase which is pronounced B'nai Elohim. Simply comes from two words, B'nai or Ben means son in Hebrew, and Elohim means God or gods in Hebrew. So pretty much very literal translation, sons of God. The table I've got there in front of us is sort of a quick way for me to summarize why I think, and in this sessions we're going to take this interpretation, that this is referring to spiritual entities. And it's mainly just the simple reason that every time this word or this phrase appears, it's meant in that context, in that understanding. So I've got here the Genesis 6 passages. You can see Genesis 6 verse 2 and 4. It's the sons of God there, and you can tell by the Greek translation next to it in the LXX that this is translated both sons of God but also angels of God, with the Greek word angel, which is angeloi, which is very explicitly tying these figures with spiritual entities. And you can see the same thing in Job 1 and 2. And the context there also helps to arrive at this conclusion, because the context, of course, of just Job 1:6 and Job 2:1 are that this happens in heaven before God's throne. And so clearly the sons of God there is referring to spiritual entities before God's throne. And also you can see in the Greek translation that it's translated angels of God. And that's very explicitly referring to spiritual entities. It appears in some manuscript versions of Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 43, where verse 8 is talking about the boundaries of men being allotted according to the number of the sons of God, or the heavenly rulers. You'll notice that the Greek translation there reads it as angels of God. And also the Dead Sea Scrolls has explicitly the sons of God language, even though other traditions have a different reading there. But that's pretty explicitly talking about humanity's nations being allotted to heavenly rulers and being allotted to the number of heavenly rulers. We will actually talk about that in our third session, looking at the tower and the nation. So I won't dwell on that for too long. But you can just see from the passage there and the translation that that's what's in mind. Deuteronomy 32:43 is more explicit. It's talking about let all the sons of God bow down before him in the context of rulers over creation, heavenly beings, sun, moon, and stars, all created order, etc. And especially also in Job 38:7, where all the sons of God sing or cry out in the context of God creating the world. They were there when God created the world. Obviously, this is before humankind even existed. So that there clearly has to be heavenly beings or spiritual entities. And then also the Greek translation, they're angels of God again. And then the last couple of ones are in the book of Psalms. These are really explicitly talking about beings that praise God in the heavens or in his throne room. And so that's why, even though the Greek translation is very literal, it goes with sons of God, the context there are talking about either Yahweh's glory in the heavens being incomparable with other spiritual beings like the sons of God, or the sons of God praising him in his throne room. And then Psalm 82 is especially interesting. They're called sons of the Most High, but they are in the previous section of that verse called gods, with the Hebrew word there, Elohim, the same one in Genesis 6. So there it's definitely talking about spiritual entities, which is interesting. And finally, Daniel 3, verse 25, talks about a spiritual entity that appears alongside Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace in Babylon. And the description of that entity is like one of the sons of the gods, is literally the Hebrew there. And the Greek translation there is one like the angels of God. So from all of that survey of the language, you can see that this word and this phrase really is talking about, in context, spiritual entities. And that's why in this discussion, we're going to run with that interpretation. As I said, I don't have time to explain all the others, but suffice it to say the others don't agree with this interpretation. But I think from all this evidence, we can see a very strong argument for the spiritual or angelic being interpretation. So it's not just the biblical texts that sort of help with this interpretation, but also other ancient Near Eastern documents that use similar language. So in the context of ancient Israel, a lot of their language is very closely connected with Canaanite language, and also with a civilization that we call, or rather a civilization that existed in the region of Ugarid. And so we sort of refer to the civilization as being Ugaritic. But these mythologies and all their texts have the same wording, B'nai Elohim, sons of God, and that refers to 70 beings who are rulers in the throne room or the council of the high God, which is pretty much the same as the portrait that we have in the Bible. These beings serve God, and they include spirits or angels, even the hosts of heaven, like the sun, moon, and stars. And we can see that that same language is the case in the Bible. And so from that, we can make another argument that understanding these sons of gods as spiritual or angelic beings is a pretty strong case for that. But we'll also see more than that in the New Testament, that this is the interpretation as well. So passages like Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2:4, where the author has in mind angels who did not keep to their own domain and they sinned, and they're kept in eternal bonds for judgment, or they're kept captive in Tartarus in the chains of darkness to be judged at the end of time. And while there are, again, different interpretations, most modern scholars, if you pick up a commentary on Jude or 2 Peter or any of the other Catholic epistles that reference these things, they are pretty much clear that the angel interpretation is referring to the Genesis 6 episode, to the degree that possibly the authors might also be quoting other Second Temple literature that interprets the Genesis 6 passage as angels, which we'll get to in a second. But the fact that the New Testament authors as well have this interpretation is a pretty strong argument for it. You'll also notice that Jude talks about the heavenly host in the same way. So there are these wandering stars who, like the angels, are reserved for darkness and gloom. And this is also the portrait that the prophets pick up on. The idea of the host of heaven being punished, the host of heaven there being paralleled with rulers of the earth. So we can understand the host of heaven as being heavenly rulers, much like the sons of God imagery. And they're gathered together to be prisoners in a pit and are sort of punished. Same with what Jude and Peter are talking about. So there's sort of a concise interpretation here. And of course, 1 Peter 3 talks about Christ proclaiming to spirits who were disobedient in the days of Noah, which is a real clear reference to this episode in Genesis 6, because obviously the episode of Genesis 6 is in the context of the pre-flood age leading up to the flood. And in fact, it gives some reasons as to why the flood occurs. So that's a very strong connection. And then obviously Revelation 12, we have this idea of angels being cast down to earth, just the same way that Satan is cast down to the earth. So the war in heaven, Satan is defeated and cast down to the earth, much like the portrait we saw in Genesis 3, where the serpent is cast down to the earth. And then we also read in Revelation, John says that angels who served him followed him, or they were thrown down with him. And that's sort of what we're going to be looking at here in Genesis 6, is angels that follow suit with the original rebel and either cast down or descend to earth to further sort of the destruction and sin from there. So what this all means is that we can view the B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God, in Genesis 6, 1-4 as representing ruling heavenly beings, and their abandonment of the positions they had to sin with women and produce evil upon the earth. And their actions cause the total perversion of humanity. And that perversion and sin leads to the flood. That's sort of what we're looking at here in Genesis 6, especially when we understand them as angelic entities. So what we're going to do from there is now turn to some of the Second Temple literature that also has the same interpretation, which is the stuff that Peter and Jude would have been aware of and referencing in those New Testament passages. This is Stephen DeYoung again. He says that texts such as First Enoch, and I would also argue there pretty much all other Second Temple literature that speaks about this also does this, brings these ideas together more explicitly, meaning they're more explicitly than the vagueness of Genesis 6, 1-4. And it preserves ancient traditions that spirits, like the serpent, led people to knowledge they were not prepared to bear in order to corrupt and destroy humanity, culminating in demonic sexual immorality. That's pretty full on. We'll discuss that more. And then he references the 1 Peter 3 passage that I just talked about as these are the spirits who sinned in the days of Noah. And so with that in mind, let's look at now some of those Second Temple literature. And perhaps before I get into that, it might be good for me to just do a quick preface that when we look at Second Temple literature and when I reference it in this discussion, we are not saying that it's divinely inspired. We are, however, saying that it helps us to understand the worldview of the authors that we're reading that are accredited as their literature being divinely inspired. And that includes New Testament authors, and it also includes interpretations of the Old Testament. So on one hand, the Second Temple literature that we read helps us to understand how ancient Jews and early Christians read the Old Testament, and that's very invaluable information for us to read it and understand it better. But then it also helps us to understand how some of this material features in the New Testament and why it features in the New Testament, especially in Jude and Peter. So with that in mind, let's dive in then. So we'll look at passages in Enoch to start with. Enoch 6 talks about the descent of the watchers, and it adds a lot more information here than Genesis 6 has. So it says that when the sons of men and multipliers, beautiful daughters were born to them, and the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And that's the watchers there, or the sons of heaven, is their interpretation of the sons of God. Again, keeping with the pretty biblical view that they're spiritual angelic beings. But then the passage goes on to add a little bit more color. So if you guys recall from the Jude sessions that we looked at when we looked at the book of Jude, I talked about how the Apocrypha and Second Temple or pseudepigrapha literature, I like to think of it like coloring in. So the biblical texts are always the basis for these literature. But often the biblical texts are more of a sketch or an outline that assume further traditions, but don't normally go into it. Whereas the Second Temple literature comes along much later and takes those stories and colors in the outline with those traditions or their own traditions. And this is what we have here in 1 Enoch 6. Says that the angels say to each other, let us choose for ourselves wives. And then it talks about how many angels they were. All of them 200 descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. And they bore great giants. So you can see that Genesis 6 is sort of vaguely that frames that verse. But the details they add, like the number of angels, where they happened and why it happened, is added. It's colored in, and it gives us more of a portrait of what's actually going on in that story. First Enoch 7 is the same. This is a little bit more in line with Genesis 6. But it says that they took for themselves wives and they began to go into them and defile themselves through them. So that adds a little bit more color into why it was bad. And that author there is talking about how it is sin, defilement, impurity. We also see this in other literature such as Jubilees, which is another early Second Temple literature. It says that humanity began to multiply on the surface of the earth. Daughters were born to them, and the angels of the Lord saw that they were beautiful to look at. So there we can see that sons of God is very much taken the Greek understanding in the Greek Bible of just straight up calling them angels. And it reads that it says they married them and they gave birth to children for them, and they were giants. And so pretty straightforward, pretty explicit. And you'll notice Jubilees is really, really close to the wording of Genesis 6. It's just more explicit on what the words mean. So the sons of God there are interpreted as angels, and the Nephilim are interpreted as giants. but you can see that literature follows more so than Enoch quite closely to Genesis 6. The Damascus document is a manuscript that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it has sort of more of a commentary and an interpretation of these passages rather than a retelling of them narratively. So it reads that the watchers of heaven, which is the interpretation of the sons of God, similar to the Enoch literature, fell because of this. This is where explaining why this happened. They were taken because they did not keep the commandments of God. Their sons, as tall as cedar trees, and whose mountains were like, whose bodies were like mountains, likewise fell. That's talking about how it happened. Why and how? Because they disobeyed the commandments of God, and likewise the sons of these unions, which are described here as tall, like mountains and trees. So like Enoch and Jubilees said, definitely giants in mind here. And it says that all flesh on the dry land perish. They are as though they had not been, because they did their own will and did not keep the commandments of their maker, so that his anger was kindled against them. And this is then going on to interpret why the flood happened. The flood happened because of this, because of the impurity and the sin that is connected with these watchers and their sons. So that's another valuable interpretation and how we should deal with this literature. And finally, the Sibylline oracles are a early Christian literature written around Egypt. And it talks about the watchers as receiving this title because they had sleepless minds in their hearts and insatiable personalities. And the language here is interesting because we could interpret this sleepless minds as like wandering minds, like sleepwalking sort of a thing. Very similar to how Jude describes the wandering stars, which are an image for angels in his literature. And also the idea of an insatiable personality is not being satisfied with what they've been given and overstepping boundaries to satisfy those desires. And that's also very similar to what Jude says. Jude says that they did not keep to their proper dwelling place, but sinned because they deserted them. So you can see that the Sibylline oracles is very similar to Jude, probably actually has the wording of Jude in mind when it talks about this episode. And then, of course, Josephus, who's writing in the early years after Jesus' death, in the Jewish Revolution, around sort of 70 AD, in that period, he interprets this as, again, in Genesis 6, about talking about angels. So he says, he just sums it up as many angels accompanied women and begot unjust sons. He goes on to call these sons giants. So that sort of brief survey, we can see how this literature was understood, how this story, a very vague story in Genesis 6, was understood as referring to spiritual entities who sinned because of their actions of descending from heaven and mating with women and causing more sin and impurity because of that. But moving forward then, Genesis 6 then goes on to say that the reason for the flood is because that the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Why is this the case? The text doesn't say, Genesis 6 doesn't express why, the relation of the complete wickedness of man and the sons of God, but later literature does. And so again, it's helpful to look at how this was understood in later Christian and ancient Jewish literature. Obviously, Enoch again is helpful here. Enoch clearly adds that the reason for the complete wickedness of humanity and how it relates to the sons of God is because the sons of God taught explicit knowledge. Knowledge that's concerned with metalworking, making weapons, making armor, things for waging war, and then also bracelets and ornaments for women, beauty products, tattoo products, ideas of magic, spells, astrology, all these sort of things that are connected with themes like sin, murder, idolatry, and immorality in later biblical texts. And so they connect the complete wickedness of humanity there with the teachings of the angels. And this is not just in the Enochic literature, it's in later literature as well. This is Noah talking here, and he explains this further when he prays to God about the fallen state of the world. He says that the angels, Aziel is one of them, has taught iniquity. So the teaching there is explicitly connected with sin, and revealed eternal mysteries that are in heaven. So knowledge that's not meant for earth because it's heavenly. Shemiyaza is another one of these angels, and he, though he was given authority to rule over the other angels and over men, he misuses that authority. And because of that, they go into daughters and lain with them and defiled themselves. They have revealed all sins and taught them to make charms and magic. So you can see there the knowledge again connected with sin and iniquity. Now look, the daughters of men have borne children by them, giants, half-breeds, and the blood of men is shed, and the whole earth is full of iniquity. Again, the logic here is that the teaching, which is forbidden teaching, it's not meant for men, it's not meant for earth, has led to sin, and that's why Genesis 6 verse 5 says that the whole earth and all the thoughts of man and all his meditations are evil. This is explaining how the logic of that verse works. Annette Yeshiko Reed has done a lot of work on this, and she very clearly just says that there are three key themes highlighted here, and it explains the logic of the text. So first, obviously, the danger of sexual impurity. And that's a really big deal throughout the rest of the Bible, especially in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament, how the dangers of sexual impurity are deeply connected with sin, strife, division, all bad things. The corrupting potential of knowledge is another thing that these texts bring out. And obviously that's really reminiscent of Genesis 3 with the serpent. The serpent's knowledge that he reveals is heavenly knowledge. He reveals to Eve that he knows what God is thinking and God's design. So he reveals heavenly knowledge, and that corrupts humanity and leads them to sin. And so we have the same thing here in Genesis 6. Divine knowledge is given to men, and it leads them into sin. It's not meant for them, the same way that it wasn't meant for Adam and Eve in the garden, and they seize it on their own terms, and it creates all manners of strife in the world. And then obviously that leads to the antediluvian proliferation of violence, which is just a fancy way of saying the spread of violence before the flood. That results in the complete wickedness of humanity and ultimately the complete destruction of the created order. The proliferation of violence is why the flood is sent, because the blood cries out. Just like in the Cain and Abel story, the blood cries out, and so God must respond with justice. James Kugel explains it a little bit more clearly and how this connects with the portrait of sin in the rest of the biblical literature. He said that these passages, the knowledge passed on to the human being was of the sort that might lead directly to sin. That's why it's called sin. That's why Noah in that passage says that they taught sin, they taught iniquity. The knowledge is part and parcel with sin. The making of swords and daggers and shields and breastplates allows humanity to commit murder and robbery, which is sin. The ability to make bracelets and ornaments and the art of making up the eyes and of beautifying the eyelids obviously leads to sexual promiscuity and all its ills. So connected with immorality there. And obviously there's a big focus on immorality in this passage because the sons of God are seduced by these women because they're beautiful, remember? And that's sort of the whole root of the issue here. And then lastly, a knowledge of precious and choice stones, gold and metalworking, is connected to the fashioning of statues and the worship of idols. So here in these passages, the sins of, the knowledge of the sons of God is directly connected with all the major portraits of sin: idolatry, immorality, violence. These are all things that are part and parcel with the fallen state of humanity. And so we see that the knowledge that the angels teach furthers the fallen state of humanity by giving them materials and instruments to further spread sin. Hence why Genesis 6 verse 5 says that now because of that, all the thoughts of men are wickedness. That's why we need the flood. So these really help to explain the logic of the passage. I think it's useful to read them. As well as this, Saint Irenaeus, who's one of the very early church fathers, in his On the Apostolic Preaching, actually has the sentiment that this is actually the main fall narrative of humanity, more so than Genesis 3. And this is interesting because in our normal framework, which is very Augustinian, we tend to think of Genesis 3 as the fall. So much so that actually if you open your Bible and read Genesis 3, often the title is The Fall. But Irenaeus actually sees Genesis 6 as being the fall. He says, for a long time, wickedness extended and spread out and reached out and laid hold of the whole race, like we were just discussing, until only a very small seed of righteousness remained, Noah and his sons. Illicit unions, so angels and women, took place when angels were united with women of the race of humanity and bore for them sons who were for their exceeding greatness called giants. The angels brought as presents for their wives teachings of wickedness. They brought them the knowledge of roots and herbs, dyeing in colors and cosmetics, the discovery of rare substances, love potions, spells of bewitchment, all manner of sorcery and idolatry, which are hateful to God. Through the entry of these things into the world, evil extended and spread, while righteousness was diminished and enfeebled. So this is one of the church fathers' early Christian interpretation. Here, early Christian interpretation, including both the Genesis passages and the Second Temple literature passages, and going, this is the full picture, this is what's going on here. And interestingly, like Reed and Kugel were pointing out in those previous slides and quotes I mentioned, the teachings are directly connected with the spread of evil. That's, I think, really helpful to see even how Irenaeus, one of the foremost church fathers, read this, how that can help us today as Christians to read this passage as well.